economics, like it's a similar thing, right? Where we have these like cycles, like Ray Dalio's 250-year cycle of civilizations, Pluto cycle. Like that's what it is, the Pluto cycle. If you look at a lot of economics stuff that, by the way, I called it pseudoscience earlier in the episode. That's what it is. That's like, they both are, it's boy pseudoscience versus girl pseudoscience. And I love both. It's fine. They're basically saying like, oh, here's these cycles that we observe that seem to happen. And maybe we have some abstract reasons for why we think they happen, but we don't really have a mechanism for why a civilization kind of rises and falls over a 250-year cycle. And if you look back at like the formation of a lot of these like economic theories and models, what you find is that a lot of them came from the time when newspapers just started. And so you had like meteorologists, astrologers, and economists all working together in these newspaper offices. And there's really solid evidence to show that there was a lot of like intermingling between economists and astrologers at this time. And so like, I don't think it's any coincidence that we have these like cycles like the 250-year cycle, the 165-year cycle, the 84-year cycle. Like if you look at these cycles from an astrological perspective, they completely line up with planetary phenomenon. And then economists give no reason why they have those years. They're just like, oh, we just have noticed this.
Welcome back to Bitcoin Season 2. I'm Charlie Spears of Blockspace Media. We're kicking off the new year with Erin Redwing. Yes, that Erin Redwing. And we're going to talk about forward-looking into 2025. We will talk about the past, present, and future in the context of, better sit down, outer planet astrology. Don't skip this episode. This may be the most important 60 minutes or so that you listen to this year because it will set you in the right path. Looking forwards. So we're going to talk with Erin about all things astrology, geopolitics, economics, and of course, Bitcoin. But first, a word from our sponsor. Bitcoin Season 2 is brought to you by Botanix. Botanix Labs is pioneering a new direction for DeFi with the first EVM L2 running on Bitcoin that's built to be forward secure, decentralized, and share gas fees generated by the network with users. See the future of DeFi at Botanix, botanixlabs.xyz. Erin, welcome to Bitcoin Season 2.
Hello, thank you for having me. Long-time listener, first-time caller. It's exciting to be here.
Yeah, I feel it's because like we've spent the past year and a half going on each other's podcasts and platforms, and I feel that this officially brings it full circle. I think we're gonna like maybe create our own parallel podcast cartel. The Maxis have their own like podcast cartel. Everybody
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think Casey might have something to worry about now because I feel like I have not yet been on a podcast where there's a formidable sort of like co-host energy. So we'll see. We'll see.
We'll see. I mean, it's just a matter of time before either Hell Money buys Blockspace or Blockspace takes over Hell Money. It's honestly, one or the other.
Yeah, it'll be a hostile takeover either way.
Yeah, it's gonna happen. Make sure to write your bets in chat who takes over who. But yeah, I don't really want to. People know you're involved with many projects, and we can get into those if the conversation goes there. But I want to roll the clock back 5 years pre-COVID. I think this is also maybe before Erin really got fully into Bitcoin, and you were studying, I believe, planetary science at Berkeley. Drop me in to this Erin Redwing, and how did you get to be the Erin that is prominent in the Bitcoin world today?
Yeah, so I started. I mean, I'll zoom out even a little bit further. I was raised by two physics nerds. Like my mom is a material scientist, my dad's a physicist. Both are atheist agnostic, and I was raised that way as well. So growing up, I kind of always thought I would do something in STEM. I was always into math and science. Also, it wasn't completely forced on me, but just, if you grow up that way, that's what you think of as normal. And so, so I studied geology in undergrad, and then I went to Berkeley for my PhD immediately after finishing my undergrad. And I just thought like, okay, I'll go on this track, and this is what my mom did, and I'll be just like her. And, I was happy with that outcome. For several reasons that didn't pan out, and now I'm a Bitcoin astrologer. One of them is that academia is terrible, which is like a whole other episode in and of itself. But another one is that, like, kind of as I was developing my interest in space science, I was also sort of becoming a little bit like spiritually interested in that as well, which I think is a natural inclination. If you look back through all of history, the study of planetary bodies was always associated with some sort of like religious or spiritual interpretation. It's only very recently that we've kind of diverged those two things. And I think a big reason for that is just that, like, there's still very many mysteries with space. We don't know, like, are we alone? Is there anyone else out there? Why do we have the solar system that we have? Why do we have the particular environment that we have? Like, our solar system is very special. And I think even like someone who's completely, spiritually divorced looking at the solar system would say that. But for me, just like learning about it, it opened more questions than it answered. And I was actually working for a summer at NASA in Los Angeles, NASA JPL. And as a result, I was hanging out with a bunch of astrology girls. They're everywhere in LA. You actually can't avoid them. They run wild. And so, when I would introduce myself to people, they would be like, "Oh my God, you're an astrologer? That's so cool." and it actually kind of worked to get me interested in it, because I've always identified with being a Leo. You're also a Leo. We've got two
I'm
Leos
also
on the pod today. And so I kind of was like, like, I wonder if I can learn about this. Like, I don't even know what the system is here, but like, what does this look like? And I went to like astro.com, pulled up my natal chart, and I realized like, oh, this is just a map of the solar system. Like, when you get a natal chart done of you, it's literally just a map of the solar system at the exact time that you were born, which like I could read as a scientist, like I could understand that. And then from that, you derive meaning with astrology. So that was like the part that I then had to kind of be like, well, so what does it mean that my sun was here, my moon was here, whatever? And I spent basically one night deep diving it. And it just made so much sense to me. And the system itself was also, I say lovingly that it's pseudoscience, because that's really what it is. It's a scientific process without a plausible mechanism. So it's very scientific to learn. And so I just loved it. It added like this whole new layer of the thing that I was already doing for my career. And I just was never able to like eradicate the mind virus out of my brain. Like, it just kept growing and growing and growing, much like Bitcoin for many people as well, I think. And
that was
Bitcoin
like
has been
reading
a similar.
the white paper moment was reading your natal chart in a way.
Yeah, exactly. So then like from that was like 2017 that I got into astrology. And then I went to do my PhD, and I kind of lived a double life for many years. Like, literally, it was
people
like,
didn't know you were quietly getting into astrology while studying planetary science or astronomy.
Yeah. It was like because planetary science is just solar system astronomy. Like, astronomy can be like cosmology and like, kind of more thinking about like the structure of the universe. But I was specifically working on like solar system stuff. And I was looking at outer planets in the solar system. Like, that was like my PhD topic. And I was getting into outer solar system astrology. And so it was literally like just living two lives where, astrologers didn't care that I was an astronomer. They thought it was cool. But astronomers were very, very antagonistic to astrology. I think unsurprisingly. It's just like, it's a natural thing to do, even though I think it comes from ignorance. And I don't know, I think that actually primed me pretty well to get into Bitcoin, because if you're used to kind of being like heretical for many years and like, thinking in a way that's not accepted by the people around you, I think it's easier to then question other systems like economics, which is another famous pseudoscience. So I feel like for me, it was astrology. I mean, astrology literally did get me into Bitcoin, which is, again, a whole other story. But I really think like just I was primed to be able to accept alternative hypotheses for the way that things work. And now I'm a Bitcoin astrologer, dropped out of the PhD program, totally left the science side behind me. And
I want to get into that in a little bit, to how we tie these two things together. It is a Bitcoin and astrology. It's a natural link. I'm kind of surprised that I wasn't aware of more people like this who would combine these two topics, but it is one of the more intuitive things I've seen. But to the listener who got this far, who like hasn't turned it off in dismissal. Like I want to get into some foundational things about astrology, but like imagine we're having a conversation and me, I'm very skeptical of astrology. Like, what is your like one-liner or way you pique that person's interest so that they might ask another question? How do you lure people in who are typically skeptical of this?
I think I mean, there's different ways I would use for different types of people. I think I'm assuming that someone who's watching this is probably like highly technical. They're interested in like more of the logic brain understanding of the way that things work. And I think the big thing for me when it comes to those types of people, which I was that type of person, I still am that type of person. I still very much am like a logic brain perspective, and I was raised that way, and I know how to think that way. Thinking about things in an illogical way is not at odds with rational thinking. Rational thinking is one way of approaching a problem, and it's really good for some things. But irrational thinking or spiritual thinking, or however you want to frame it, is just a different tool in the tool belt. And for me, learning astrology was essentially like expanding a new vocabulary through which to understand, particularly like the human experience. Like I would say it's kind of like a vocabulary for human psychology or like human archetypes. And that doesn't conflict with a rational understanding of reality. It's just a different way. And I think that's like the thing that often like makes people be like I don't like this, is that they don't want to be told that they're wrong. And they certainly don't want to be told that they're wrong by crazy people who believe irrational things. And like, I've never felt like the rational interpretation of reality was wrong, just that it's like one way of looking at things. And I don't know, even just from the perspective of like, your perspective makes your reality. That's something that's like relatively uncontroversial to say at this point. Like you and the laws through which you understand your world end up shaping your experience more than anything else. And so, like there's a lot of irrational thinking in the way that you interpret the world, even if you think that you're a very rational person. And so like maybe naming those irrational impulses or those, spiritual fervor moments or whatever you want to call them, like naming them and placing them in a certain bucket might actually help you become a better rational thinker, because you're able to like parse those things out rather than assuming like I'm always rational. So yeah, that's my way of trying to sell it to people.
Yeah, in a way, it's very similar to Bitcoin, where both of these interests and passions suffer from like the pop Bitcoin or pop astrology, like top of funnel, which is most people's immediate initial perception of these two things. So there's kinship there between astrology and Bitcoin. So let's lay some foundational groundwork. I frankly have listened to a lot of your astrology discourse and associated people, and still have possessed very few of the building block like terminology or language for any of this, like how it works. For us to have a productive conversation, it might help for you to like explain some basics about it, like what do I need to know so that we can have a conversation about outer planet astrology and economics?
Totally. So, most people are familiar with their sun sign. That's like, I'm a Leo, you're a Scorpio, whatever. The reason why you're familiar with that particular sign, which is just the sign that the sun was in at the time that you were born, is because it's easy to find. It's just your birthday. But for astrologers that are looking at like a whole natal chart or the map of the solar system at that time, they're also looking at where Mars was, where Mercury was, where Jupiter was, where Neptune was, Pluto, etc. And so you have this whole big map that's created of, all these different planetary objects that you then derive meaning from. And so, for the sun sign, that's a 1-year cycle. Like it takes Earth 1 year to go around the sun, and it spends approximately a month in every sign. And so you just kind of that's where like a lot of the pop astrology horoscope stuff comes from. It's just like, today is going to feel like this for a Taurus, and that stuff is fine. But, something that I think is really interesting and that really got me hooked in astrology is that, we have all these planets that are way further out, and as a result have much longer orbital cycles. So, the sun has a 1-year cycle. Mercury and Venus are also, they're inner planets, so they also have about a 1-year cycle. Mars is about 2 years. And then moving out from there into like the gas giant planets, Jupiter is 12 years, Saturn is 28 years, Uranus is 84 years, Neptune is 165 years, Pluto is 250 years. So if you start looking at those cycles, on the order of decades or hundreds of years, you can start looking at civilizational phenomena. So instead of saying, oh, I'm a Taurus, so I'm going to feel this way, you can look at the natal chart of, let's say, the United States of America starting July 4th, 1776, and you can say, oh, wow, it's been 250 years since then. The US is going through its Pluto return. Like Pluto has made its way the whole way around. And so you can start kind of looking at those sort of larger term cycles. And actually, there's interesting lore with economics in general. So, economics does a lot of this.
This is one of my favorite topics. I wanted to get to this question because this is the thing that blew my mind. The listener, pay attention.
So economics, like, it's a similar thing, right? Where we have these like cycles, like Ray Dalio's 250-year cycle of civilizations, Pluto cycle. Like, that's what it is, the Pluto cycle. If you look at a lot of economics stuff that, by the way, I called it pseudoscience earlier in the episode. That's what it is. That's like, they both are, it's boy pseudoscience versus girl pseudoscience. And I love both. It's fine. But, they're basically saying like, oh, here's these cycles that we observe that seem to happen. And maybe we have some abstract reasons for why we think they happen, but we don't really have a mechanism for why a civilization kind of rises and falls over a 250-year cycle. And if you look back at like the formation of a lot of these like economic theories and models, what you find is that a lot of them came from the time when newspapers just started. So newspapers only became popular in the early 1900s. The daily paper, like where you go outside your doorstep and there's a paper on the ground and you like read the news for the day. Before that, like you would get your news from wherever, but it wasn't on like this every single day. We need content. And so basically, what happened is these newspapers that now had to produce daily content needed to fill it. They needed to figure out like, what do we say every day? There's not necessarily news every day. And so, what are the obvious daily columns that come out? Okay, weather is something that changes every day. So you have a weatherman who works at the paper and writes up, it's going to be sunny today, whatever. You might have an astrologer. That's actually the rise of horoscopes, where the astrologer can say, hey, like the sun is here, and so Taurus is going to whatever. It's like a lot of content to fill. And then they also had economists that would do that. So economists would then say, here's the market for today. The market is dependent on this, and this. And so you had like meteorologists, astrologers, and economists all working together in these newspaper offices. And there's really solid evidence to show that there was a lot of like intermingling between economists and astrologers at this time. And so like, I don't think it's any coincidence that we have these like cycles, like the 250-year cycle, the 165-year cycle, the 84-year cycle. Like if you look at these cycles from an astrological perspective, they completely line up with planetary phenomenon. And then economists give no reason why they have those years. They're just like, oh, we just have noticed this.
It's the
like,
fourth turning. It's a new generation, or like
Exactly.
it's the time that it takes for a money to die or whatever. I don't know, that kind of thing.
Yes, yeah. The fourth turning is the Uranus return cycle. It's like 84 years, about 4 generations. Yeah, so it's like these things inform each other. And for me, it's just like, let's just make these things explicit rather than like say like, no, this one is logic and this one's like totally illogical and we need to keep these things separate. It's like, let's just admit that we have some level of illogical and logical reasoning put into all of our understandings of the world. And like, let's just agree to that on a baseline. Doesn't mean we have to say astrology is real or economics are real or whatever. But like, I just think there's so much less rationality in a lot of things that people think are highly rational. And it would be better to just like be able to say that and not have that be, sinful.
So fascinating. You explain it better than I think other people have. So that said, it may be confirmation bias, but I do think this is one of the most interesting times to be a human. And 2025 is one of the more interesting years in this very unique period. And this may be, as I think we were talking in a side chat, this may be, we may have insight to some of this very interesting times from the study of outer planet astrology. What is interesting in 2025, and how does outer planet astrology inform this perspective?
Yeah, so the outer planets are basically Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, the furthest planets out. And because they have such long cycles ranging from like 84 years to 250 years, they really don't apply to individuals. They can, like, you can live to 84 or maybe 165 someday. But in general, we use them to understand like geopolitical phenomenon. And in 2025, we have all three of those planets moving into new signs. So, each of those planets, if you take that like 84, 165, 250, divide it by 12, that's like how long it spends in each sign. Those numbers are still really large. Like for Uranus, it's like 8 years in a sign. For Neptune, it's about like 15. For Pluto, it can be up to 40. And so to have all of those coincide in 1 year, where in 2025, all of them are moving into new energies, essentially, is a way of thinking about it. That's really rare to have happen. We also, if you zoom out even further from the planets and you look at the actual structure of the solar system and the orbit of Earth around the sun and how that changes over many, many years, we also are in the transition of the precession of the equinoxes. So the equinoxes, that's just like the spring equinox, right? That's like the beginning of the calendar, or the astrological calendar.
It's like directly parallel to the sun or whatever.
Yeah, it's like spring. The beginning of spring is spring equinox. There's fall equinox. So that position of Earth and Sun changes over time, and it's a very long-term cycle. It's like 26,000 years is like the total cycle. So divide that by 12, and you get about 2,000 years in a cycle. And we're also at the transition from one age into another there. So we literally have like all of the longest cycles in astrology are all like converging at this time. And if you just think about it from your own experience, like we are obviously living in an incredibly transformative time, like there's lots of people that would like to say like, oh, well, maybe the internet won't change that much, maybe it's only going to affect certain facets of life. No, there's no way. There's no way. Like we already feel it. We already see it. The fact that we're even able to have this conversation is crazy, we are living through incredibly transformative times, and the astrology says this as well. The nice thing about being able to look at the astrology is you can look back in history and see different times where either a similar transformation happened or when the last era started, like what were the transformations that we saw. And there's really interesting, like particularly for the US. I also like to focus on the US just because I'm American, so it's an easy point of reference for me.
Yeah, you could say the world revolves around us.
Right, the world revolves around us. We're the culture makers, so it's easy to just like put that at the center and then assume that there's fallout all around the world from whatever we choose to do.
Yeah.
If you look at just the US, and you look at like the past like Uranus, Neptune, Pluto cycles, we are living through like like very interesting times in terms of those cycles as well. So we can start with Pluto, which is the furthest out one. That's 250 years. The US turned 250 in 2016. So that was like our Pluto return. It's a longer term kind of cycle, but think about what happened in 2016 and, what kind of transformative kind of tower collapsing moments we might have had in 2016. Because Pluto is the god of the underworld. Pluto is about like the muck bringing itself up to the surface and making itself known. And then if the foundations are not stable, the tower collapses. That's like the way that Pluto works. So we went through that in the United States. Then if you look at Neptune, so we're going through a Neptune return as well. 165 years, so loosely like divisible by 2 from that. The previous time that we had Neptune, where it will be in 2025, was the Civil War. The time before that was the Revolutionary War. So that's interesting times to be living through.
But Neptune's the god of old age. I forget.
Yeah, Neptune. Yeah, Neptune is spirituality. So it's about like death and like kind of like your spiritual understanding of things. It also can deal with like delusions, drugs, anything that kind of like takes you out of your state of mind.
Gotcha.
So Neptune is kind of like an intense sort of like psychological energy. And then Uranus, 84 years, go back last cycle, that was World War II. Cycle before that was the Civil War. Cycle before that, revolutionary. So like similarly, you see these like very interesting periods of time. And yeah, for an astrologer, it's just like super exciting to be able to see these things before they happen, to see like 2025 and all of this energy coming in and just get to like make the popcorn and watch and see how it plays out. Like it's just, it adds a really fun framework to, I think, the chaotic transformation that we already all know is here.
So we have the convergence of many planetary cycles. Is that the term?
Yeah.
We have we can map this to history, which sets the stage for the present. What outside of us just knowing that 2025's big things coming? I mean, what is there? Is there anything like that? Anything particular that we should expect? Like what type of personality does the year 2025 have, and maybe what types of events or things might we expect? Let's start with maybe economics and sociocultural, and then we can't get more than 25 minutes in before we start talking about eventually Bitcoin.
Right.
So, yeah.
Yeah. So 2025, I think, is the way I would describe it is it's kind of the last grasping breath of control over a narrative that cannot be controlled from here on out. And, if you're like a conspiracy theory type person, which many Bitcoiners are, I think there's lots of people that interpret that in their own way. But really, like, what it means is that we're moving into an age where information is freely available. Anyone can say anything, and it's very difficult to verify truth or reality, much less so like control it, And so I think in 2025, what we'll see is a sort of last attempt at control by the powers that have been able to maintain control for many years. I think they will fail, not because there will be a new uprising of some organization or people or whatever that will be able to obtain power, but really just to a decentralized understanding of reality. And decentralization is actually the word that brought me to Bitcoin from astrology, because Aquarius is the sign of decentralization. This is like the huge energy that's going on right now. We're at the dawning of the age of Aquarius. Maybe people are familiar with that phrase from like the hippies in the 60s
yes, the
and
hippies
70s.
in the 60s. They say songs about it. They wrote disco about it. Yeah.
Exactly. Like all new age spirituality is always talking about like the age of Aquarius. We're in the age of Aquarius. This is the precession of the equinoxes cycle that I was talking about a little bit earlier. It's a 2000-year era that we're at this like transition into right now. And Aquarius is it's the sign of decentralization. It's about being an individual in a network of other individuals, maintaining your autonomy. So you're not like losing yourself in other people. You're not like becoming like one incoherent mass. You are one individual that recognizes another person's autonomy, and then you guys work together in the ways that make sense, and you don't in other ways. I'm describing Bitcoin essentially, and that was like what made Bitcoin click for me. Was I was looking for these sort of structures, these sort of Aquarian decentralized structures. But it's like, so we have Bitcoin that's like a great example of it. Like literally, like that's the structure of it. But I think in general, everything is headed in that sort of direction. Another way of thinking about it could be like non-hierarchical. Like it's not like a top-down process. It's like a mycelial network of different ideas that connect together. And so I think we're seeing that happen in all of information space over the next couple years. And 2025 is like a lot of new beginnings and a lot of closing outs. So that's why I say there's like these kind of last breaths of attempts to kind of control things. By 2026, we're like fully in the new. So my advice for people that I've kind of been saying is like, don't get too attached to things looking a certain way, because transformation will always end up in a different place than you expect it to go. And it's the fact that you're even able to like consume content about Bitcoin at the beginning of 2025 means that you've been able to like think independently and like have your mind changed about things. And so like, I think the thing that's sort of the challenge for people now that are like in this Bitcoin world or crypto world or whatever is like, don't then all of a sudden get like married to the idea that like you're right in the exact format that you're in right now. Like transformation is still happening and you still have to keep up if you want to be on like the cutting edge of that, you know? So 2025, like stay open, still try to think about things with the open-mindedness that allowed you to even be here in the first place. And I think that's like the happy path. That's the best way to proceid.
It sounds like you're talking about a soft fork, Erin. You
Oh my
sound
gosh.
like you're talking about a Bitcoin soft fork.
That's a great point. That's a great point, Charlie. Yeah, I mean, you know, it's a decentralized process of many nodes coming together and deciding to transform, not from a top down or a, you know, oligarchic perspective. Yeah, I mean, I think like, I mean, we could totally talk about Bitcoin maxi religion. Like, I would love to talk about that, but I don't know if we should stay on 2025 or
let's stay on 2025. We'll come back to it.
Yeah,
I mean,
I have a lot of thoughts.
So 2025, year of transition, 2026, indicating that we come out of that transition. Is 2026 a more stable year, or it's just we have resolved the transition?
It's much more stable. It's much more stable. So really like 2020 through 2025 was a lot of transformation, chaos, endings, particularly 2020.
You're telling me, yeah. It was crazy.
Right. Anyone who's lived this knows that this is true, you know? 2020 in particular was a lot of endings. And then like the further that we go, the more like new beginnings, like the more that there's new beginnings rather than just endings. So 2020 was like almost all endings. There was like a couple blips of new Age of Aquarius energy at that time, but it really was closing out. And so, you know, we're in this like transition time. And by 2026, we're sort of like out of the transition. Like we're in the new energy. In 2025, there's particular dates. I mean, you know, for people that probably like if anyone's this interested at this point, like they want to know like, what do I need to do? Yeah. In 2025, really like something in March and April happens that's extremely chaotic. And I don't know what it's going to be because it's just chaotic energy. Like it's something very like earth shaking kind of, I don't know what it's going to be, but I know something will happen. That's like mid-March to early April. And if you look at like, I have charts from Bitcoin, the US, China, you know, Trump, whatever. If you look at all these charts, they all are experiencing like transformation as a result of, it's essentially a series of eclipses and a couple planets moving into new signs that happens in March and April. And they're all affected. So I don't know what will happen, but I assume the markets will be affected by that in some way. And then the summer is very positive. Like the summer is like, we get these little bursts of energy that feel much more like 2026 and like the transformation beyond. So I would expect this spring to, I think I said this in the Hell Money episode, but like January, February is like peak hopium. Like if you're looking for like the top of like the current cycle that we're in.
I'm going to sell the rumor. Quantum cats go to 10 Bitcoin and I buy another house. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Like that's the like, January, February, I think is like, you know, people are wondering how long this current thing will last. I mean, we're already a little bit down right now, but I think that's kind of like the peak for this current cycle of Bitcoin 100K. Woohoo. This is awesome. It's not so much that March and April are like definitely a market crash. But I think whenever there's chaotic volatility in real life, Bitcoin is obviously a highly volatile asset, even regardless of that. And if you add that on top of it, it's just like even more volatility, which also means opportunity. You know, it's another way of thinking about it. So I think we'll experience a lot of volatility in March and April. And then by the summer, I think we're actually in a much nicer place. And the second half of 2025 it's like review and reworking. Like we're like recovering from whatever happened in the first half and we're like picking up the pieces and putting things back together. So the as I said, my advice is like stay flexible and like don't allow yourself to just like go down with a ship just because you think it has to turn out a certain way. Cause like crazy shit can always happen and it seems like it will. So staying flexible, being willing to like ride the wave, all those kind of things are definitely going to be an important part of getting through, particularly the first half of 2025.
Other interesting dates, second half of 2025. We've made it through a comparatively calm summer. Bring me into to fall and winter. Where are we this time next year?
I think it's going to depend on the fallout from whatever happens in the spring. It is quite positive. So actually, particularly like October, November, one of the cool things about outer planet astrology is you can also look at the relationships between the planets because they all are moving in different cycles. Sometimes they make angles to each other, and like we as astrologers derive meaning from that. So there's a cycle between Saturn and Jupiter that started in 2020. This was like the only tiny little blip of like new exciting energy that came in 2020, and it came in December 2020, the end of 2020. And this was like what got me into Bitcoin. Long story, but like that's what ended up bringing me down the rabbit hole.
What's the name of this particular phenomena?
So it's the Saturn-Jupiter cycle. So in 2020, on the solstice, Saturn and Jupiter were at the exact same point. So they were conjunct.
Okay.
And they were conjunct at 1 degree of Aquarius. So the beginning of Aquarius. It was like super like, oh my gosh, new Aquarius energy coming in. What's it going to be? And that resulted in me going down the rabbit hole because Bitcoin was back to 18K. It had like reached its previous all-time high at that point. And I just noticed it. I didn't know anything about Bitcoin. I just noticed that. And so kind of went off from there and never came back out of the rabbit hole.
Yeah.
But that cycle, so it like starts at the conjunction. And then because Jupiter moves faster than Saturn, like they both move and they like form angles to each other and they like keep moving, and then eventually they meet up again. And so like astrologers look at those angles and we use that as a way of like describing the push-pull between those two entities. And in November, I think it's like November 2nd through 21st, we have a trine between those two objects, which is just 120 degrees. It's like a harmonious aspect. It's triangle. Like it's an easy sort of energy. And so I think what we'll see at that time after kind of a spring of chaos is, whatever cycle started at the end of 2020, which, maybe it's a personal cycle for you, but I think on a societal level, it was kind of like coming out of COVID year and figuring out like, okay, what has collapsed and what does that mean for what I think is like actually viable moving forward? Like, what do I want to plant the seeds for that I think are realistic to grow, given that all of these things have collapsed or they've kind of proven that they're not as stable or solid as I used to think that they were. That was the beginning of that cycle. We're at essentially the first supportive aspect to that in 2025, November 2025. So in November 2025, that's a time to kind of look back on the previous 5 years and just be like, okay, what did I plant and how is it growing? Like what did I discover at that time? For me, it was Bitcoin, right? Like I discovered Bitcoin at that time. So then November 2025, I'll look back and be like, oh my God, I discovered Bitcoin 5 years ago. And now I'm a Bitcoin astrologer who's doing X, Y, or Z, and who knows like what will happen by November after the spring. But I think that's kind of like as I said, like the second half of the year is a lot about reflection and reworking. And then 2026, like kind of beginning of 2026 is like, we're in the new world. So I would say like, if you have, things that you're trying to launch or things that you really want to like lock in for a certain amount of time, it's the first half of the year. Like the first half of the year is the time to like be on the timeline, see what's going on, not go crazy. Like don't go crazy. Keep your head. Don't allow yourself to be like wrapped up in crazy narratives, but like stay alert and like use that to your advantage if you can. As I said, like volatility also means opportunities. And then the second half of the year is like picking up the pieces, doing like the integration mentally, spiritually, whatever, and just being like, wow, what did I do over the last 5 years? Like, was it worth it? Was it good? How should I change things? And yeah, then I think like if you can get through If you can get through April, you're fine. That's really like the main message. If you can get through April.
I'm going to lock in. I'm sitting forward in my chair right now.
Mm-hmm.
This is, yeah. The beauty is like, I think a lot of people expect astrology to give you very discrete specifics, like Bitcoin is going to be this exact price on this certain day. And maybe there are people who do that. But if anything, if you've listened to the past 40 minutes, I hear you saying astrology gives you a structure or a lens to view things and useful directionality. And so that's what I hear. I want to get into the callback to the Bitcoin memetics, cults, and religion. You know, it's funny because I, for years, have said people told me, oh, that Bitcoin, crypto, that's like a cult. And I say, no, it's not a cult. It's a religion. But it's funny because we've seen it seems like we've seen cults within Bitcoin emerge. As Udi calls them, the laser eyes. They tend to have their own lingo even within Bitcoin about how things are, and they do behave. They have their figureheads, and they have their savior, who appeared in 2020, by the way, Michael Saylor.
And he's an Aquarius.
Damn. Okay. Well. Okay. So run with this. What are your thoughts on Bitcoin as a cult? How does this relate to or compare to astrology? And what are your views?
So I think, obviously, maybe not every single Bitcoiner has like a spiritual reverence for Bitcoin, but I think it's very common too. I think most people, even if they are completely like atheist logic brain, don't think about, they're not like in touch with that side of themselves, or it's not an important part of their life. They still feel a sort of like, I guess what I would describe is I see a lot of people who feel like an obligation to serve Bitcoin in some way, to be of service to Bitcoin.
I've described myself like this a lot. I talk about this a lot. I don't know why. I just feel drawn to it.
Yeah, I'm the same way. Like it's, and I've just met so many people, whether it's like devs, enthusiasts, macro guys, whatever, like that just all feel this pull to Bitcoin, and it really like transforms the way that you see the world and the way that you live your life. And I think that like that type of spiritual reverence is very important to what Bitcoin is. It's not just like a bunch of people working on it because it's money. Of course, that's also what it is. But it's like, there's some sort of like pull that people have that they start to like form their world around it. And I think that's like what people are describing when they say it's like a cult, because that's what a cult does, right? A cult like forces you to like form your world around it. The difference with Bitcoin, and I think this is like the problem that a lot of the Saylor style maxis have, is that Bitcoin is a decentralized cult. There's no cult leader. There's no like, Joseph Smith or Bible or sort of like, this is what you follow. These are the rules. And I'm the one who tells you that. Bitcoin is this kind of like ever-changing sort of, you could call it a technology, you could call it like a discovery or an invention or whatever you want to call it. It's like, it's this thing that just like pulls you in and you find your way of working with it or on it or being of service to it. And I think that like what's happened is that like people feel that very strong spiritual pull that I think is natural. I think there's a reason why there's no, major atheist civilizations throughout all of history. It's because we have a natural spiritual impulse as people. I think that's just part of who we are and what we are. So, like that spiritual impulse that a lot of Bitcoiners have, they don't have like the vocabulary to explain this decentralized like religion, essentially, or this decentralized spiritual connection. They instead put it in terms that they can understand through monotheism, which has been like the dominant religion over the last 2,000 years throughout the age of Pisces. They say Bitcoin is like Jesus, or maybe Michael Saylor is like Jesus, or maybe Michael Saylor is like Paul, or like an apostle, or like, Satoshi was Jesus. And like, it's like, they put these like narratives into it that don't quite work. I do think there's an interesting like Satoshi Bitcoin immaculate conception narrative. Like there's certainly like parallels you can draw between Bitcoin and like a Christian mythos, but it doesn't quite work in that structure of like, you know, Catholicism where you have like a pope and they say that this is the law and like this is what you can and can't do. There's no person like that for Bitcoin, but I think because people experience this spiritual reverence towards Bitcoin, and the only vocabulary that they have for understanding spiritual reverence is like a Christianity or monotheism perspective, they then impose that on Bitcoin. And so they start acting like a cult. They start acting like Michael Saylor is Jesus or whoever is Jesus. And anyone who doesn't believe in this or doesn't believe in exactly what I believe is an enemy of me and I have to attack them. Like it doesn't quite work. But I think, you know, a lot of the Bitcoin season 2 people, they have this perspective, this like kind of Reddit atheist bro perspective of like, well, you know, some of us don't look at Bitcoin that way. Some of us are actually just really logical about it. And we can see that, you know, you just need to change it. It's like bullshit. You guys still have this like spiritual obsession with Bitcoin. You're just like not acting the way that the maxis are acting. Like, I think it's not that like these people need to eradicate their spiritual impulse. They just need to have like a more healthy outlet for it or like a better vocabulary for understanding it. And to me, like that's part of why I try to like preach Bitcoin astrology or just astrology as a way of understanding this, because astrology is decentralized religion. There's no like first astrologer who said like Scorpios are emotionally manipulative and now everyone must believe that. Like there's no Bible, there's no doctrine, there's no leaders of astrology. It's just like a process of observation that many people have participated in over thousands of years. And, you know, if you look at the way that astrology functions now, it's just people learning on their own through like resources like different books or on the internet or following different astrologers, but there's no like centralized authority for astrology. Even me, like I practice astrology, I give readings, like I'm not credentialed. There's no like, where would I go to get like an astrology like ministry degree? It doesn't really exist, you know? And so like astrology essentially functions as like a vocabulary for understanding human experience. I said that earlier in the episode, but that's really what it is. It's just like, here is a list of different human archetypes or energies that people experience that you can map out into your present reality or into the past or into the future. And you can use that as a way of like adding another lens of understanding to your experience. And no one's going to tell you that this is right or wrong. And there's lots of different schools. And it's very much like, I mean, New Age spirituality in general is like, take what works for you and leave what doesn't, you know, love and light. Like just, you know, if it doesn't resonate, scroll past, like that kind of vibe, you know? And a lot of people hate on it for that. Like they're like, oh, well, that means it's bullshit. Or, you know, that means like it can mean anything or it can apply to anything. But like, that's kind of, I think, what makes it beautiful is it's like, it's up to you and your own interpretation. It's up to you and your own understanding to kind of like apply it where it makes sense in your life. And like, I don't know, with Bitcoin, it's like, I think the spiritual reverence aspect is like very important. Like, it's not something that I think, even if you want to stamp it out, you can't. Like, it's a really important part of what this is. Like, there's clearly some sort of pull that people feel in that kind of spiritual way. I just want people to be able to define it for themselves, or if not for themselves, to be able to define it in a non-hierarchical, decentralized way, rather than listening to Daddy Saylor tell you that this is what Bitcoin should be, an Aquarius who happened to enter the Bitcoin scene in 2020. Yeah, so I don't know. It's like, it's just, and I found honestly like that, like, I mean, I'm on the ordinal side of Bitcoin, so I'm not in like maxi land, but I consider myself to be a Bitcoin maxi for all intents and purposes. Like I am a Bitcoin maximalist, and I still have a lot of Bitcoin maxi friends. And a lot of them, by the way, are very open to Bitcoin astrology because it does help them understand their experience. Like they relate to it, you know? So I don't know. I'm like, let me preach Bitcoin astrology to the maxis and maybe I can fix them.
You can fix them. I mean, I like, you know, I'll reflect back, you know, I think on other Bitcoin Season 2 episodes, I've said like the same open mind which drew me to Bitcoin originally long ago I try to keep and hold that because I just don't think that Charlie, 10 or some odd years ago was like totally dialed in and just got it right in a flash of brilliance. No, it feels that every year that I continue to be involved and active in Bitcoin, I understand it differently.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, this is kind of what brought me to Ordinals. It was the most curveball perspective on Bitcoin. It was fresh that I'd not seen before, and that's why we're having this conversation, I guess.
And by the way, Ordinals is literally Bitcoin astrology in that it takes natural cycles of time in Bitcoin and ascribes meaning to them. Like rare sats literally are Bitcoin astrology. So I'm a Bitcoin astrologer through many lenses.
Casey is just he's the least, he's not credentialed at all, but he's everyone draws they trace their family astrology tree to him.
Exactly. Yeah. He's just one school of thought.
One school of thought. Yeah. Okay, so wrapping up, let's look very, very far for the future. One of the things which I found most interesting ever was your perspective on the Aquarian age and the Bitcoin supply schedule and issuance of Bitcoin wrapping up in the early 2100s. What does Bitcoin look like in the far off distant future? A lot of us, a lot of people today try to predict like short-term price of like $1 million or $10 million. They try to predict how Bitcoin looks over the next 10 years. What does Bitcoin look like over the next 100 years?
So what you're referencing with the 2140 thing in the age of Aquarius. So this was one of the things where I looking at the Bitcoin Wikipedia page in December 2020, where I was like, oh my God, like I've stumbled on something very important here, is the age of Aquarius and the transition from different astrological ages is a long process. It's like a slow moving process. It stays in a sign for 2000 years. And so there's like about 100 so years where it's like transitioning between two ages. In our case, we're transitioning from the age of Pisces, which I would describe as the age of monotheism. It started with the birth of Jesus Christ in the year 0. That was when, we had that transition from Aries to Pisces. So like we're in that transition now, 2000 years later, from Pisces to Aquarius, age of monotheism to age of decentralization. And that transition happens over essentially like the beginning of the millennium. But if you put it in like astronomical calculations, it happens from the year 2000 to the year 2140. So in 2140, that's when we are in the age of Aquarius by astronomical measures. And so that's a year that I look at a lot, as an astrologer who previously didn't know anything about Bitcoin. And it's interesting that is, of course, the end of the Bitcoin supply being distributed. That's like the end of the one sat final epic of Bitcoin supply being distributed. And to me, I don't know what Bitcoin will look like in terms of how it will fit into our society. This is also going back to what I said about not getting too attached to Bitcoin needs to do X, Y, or Z. Bitcoin needs to be X, Y, or Z. We don't know what Bitcoin will be or how it will function in the world. But I think essentially what Bitcoin is this transition technology that's helping us to move into the age of decentralization. And so what I wonder about is Bitcoin is perfect decentralized money, perfect, whatever. Maybe people would complain about certain aspects of it, but it's it essentially is the discovery of decentralized money or the invention of decentralized money. And I think that we will see Bitcoin-like things in different facets of the world or, different facets of society or understanding of reality. And Bitcoin is just solving this very key, important part of our macroeconomic geopolitical system. So I don't know how Bitcoin will fit in, but I think, again, going back to what I was talking about, Bitcoin kind of changing you or you ending up sort of forming your perspective around Bitcoin. I think Bitcoin is teaching us very important lessons about how to harness our own individual incentives in order to work in a decentralized way. Because as I said before, Aquarius is not about losing yourself in the collective. It's not about logging onto the internet, and becoming a part of the hive mind and not being an individual anymore. Like, no, Aquarius is one of the most individualistic signs. Leo and Aquarius are the two individualistic signs. We're very familiar with this.
Yeah.
Aquarius it's very important for Aquarius to maintain its individuality, but the thing with Aquarius that makes it really like smart and kind of its strength is that it knows how to identify other people's individuality to find ways of working with others. So it knows how to essentially balance like individual incentives in order to create like non-hierarchical structures. And I think like Bitcoin is essentially like starting to teach us those sort of lessons that Aquarius is like that's really like the age of Aquarius energy. So I don't know, like I'm very curious to see, especially as we move through the next couple decades, like how conversations about Bitcoin's supply and, you know, the fees that are necessary in order to keep Bitcoin decentralized, like how those conversations will progress. Because I feel like even if you just look at like, you know, the slowly decreasing supply and how like the lesson is being taught to us slowly over time, and we have to like learn as we go, like how do we sustain this thing? Is it important enough for us to sustain? Like it's again, the spiritual narrative, like there's just something there that's like it's just beautifully timed. And it's I don't know, like I don't know how these problems will be solved, you know, whether it comes to like scaling or just like literally like the supply and like maintaining fees. But I think we have to be open to ideas coming out and seeing how people adopt them. You know, like ordinals is potentially like one solution to the fee problem, right? Like let's be open to accepting different solutions to these problems that we know we'll have to deal with over the next couple of decades, because I think like this is the process of like learning how to like rewire our brains around like allowing ourselves to have our incentives and our values, and also allow other people to have their incentives and their values, and figure out how we work together or how we don't. And that's fine too. You know, like we can also allow people that maybe are on the other side of the network to like do their thing over there while we do our thing over here. And we don't have to control them or stop them. You know, that's not part of it, you know? So I don't know. I'm very curious to see how the next couple years tune out. I mean, we're living through really interesting times. Like that's really the main point. And I think by like the 2030s, I mean, just kind of like off the dome astrology, I think by the 2030s, we're definitely in like a, you know, I don't know what your definition of hyper Bitcoinization is, but I think by 2032, we're looking at a world that like has very much accepted Bitcoin. Bitcoin is a very integrated part of our society. Even if it's not on an individual level, it's like much more understood. So yeah. I think a lot of these conversations that you in particular are having about like soft forks changes to Bitcoin, like right now they're happening in like our nerd cult, but like I think eventually they'll be happening on like a global scale. So, you know, we have to figure out how to have those conversations in the nerd cult. I think that would be ideal.
I'm just looking forward to when we at the World Economic Forum debate the next soft fork.
Exactly.
Each country sends their representative, and the hashing giant of Sudan sends their diplomat, and so those kind of things. So wrapping up, 30 seconds. What does Bitcoin Season 2 look like? What does Bitcoin Season 2 this podcast? We have a natal chart. It was I forget, it was March of 2024. I think March 4th. Let me check.
I see it, March 25th, 2024.
March 25th, 2024. What's one thing which defines Bitcoin Season 2?
So one thing I've been really talking about a lot is Pluto and Aquarius. Obviously, I'm talking about it on Twitter. If you follow me, you see me talking about it all the time. So Bitcoin Season 2, the podcast, March 25th, 2024, has Pluto and Aquarius. And I've been thinking a lot about this as like a generational placement. Like the babies being born right now, or the babies that will be born over the next 20 years will all have Pluto and Aquarius. And this is like a generational placement. And I really think that like these types of things, whether it's like humans or ideas or companies or whatever that are created at this time, are going to be able to weather the storm of the transformation of technology much better than all of us that came before. Like, if you think about the millennials, like the millennials are in a constant state of like, oh my God, like, should I look at my screen or should I go outside? I don't know what to do. Like, it's like a war in their mind all the time for like what kind of role technology should play in their life. And I think the things that are being created now, again, whether it's like a podcast, a company, a child, there's just like a much more innate like way of integrating all these things. And so I feel like Bitcoin season 2, you know, with all of those energies available to it in this new age that we're in, is really able to like integrate a lot of different technological ideas. I mean, even the fact like you're able to just like reach people all around the world and bring them together and like have all these ideas shared in long form for many different people to consume at their own time. Like, I don't know, it doesn't seem like a revolutionary idea because we kind of are used to it, but like it's revolutionary. And especially like the conversations that you're able to have in terms of technical depth, like it's just not something that we could have even had, I think, like 3 or 4 years ago in Bitcoin world. So that's, I think, the main bullish sign. It's like, again, as I said, it's always Pluto and Aquarius for me. That's like the most important placement. If you can get some Pluto and Aquarius energy, plant some Pluto and Aquarius seeds, you're going to be good for the next 2,000 years.
You heard it here first. Bitcoin season 2 for 2,000 years, and then somebody can start Bitcoin season 3 in
exactly
4,025. So. Thank you so much, Erin. I feel like we got to do this every year on the cusp of the new year.
Exactly.
1,000 podcasts shall bloom.
2,000 podcasts.
2,000 podcasts shall bloom. Thank you so much for coming on Bitcoin Season 2, and I will see you at whichever conference we find ourselves at next.
Thanks for having me, Charlie. Happy New Year.